Getting older doesn't weaken your voice. It sharpens what actually matters. But as life gets louder, protecting your private emotional space becomes less about shutting people out and more about choosing what you let in. Let's talk about how to guard that inner room no one else gets to decorate. Defining your emotional boundaries in older age starts with recognizing that your inner world has value, weight, and limits. The more life you've lived, the more clarity you deserve about what you're willing to hold and what no longer fits. Boundaries aren't walls, they're instructions. They teach people how to treat you and remind you how to treat yourself. When you define them, you're not being rigid or distant, you're being clear. And clarity is kindness, both to others and to yourself. The first step is identifying what drains you emotionally. Maybe it's certain conversations that always leave you feeling smaller. Maybe it's people who assume you have endless time, patience, or emotional availability because you've always shown up before. Pay attention to those moments where your body tightens, your voice softens, or your thoughts spiral after an interaction. That reaction is data. It's your mind alerting you that something crossed a line you didn't realize was even there. Once you recognize what drains you, you begin to understand what protects you. And emotional protection isn't selfish, it's maintenance. Your emotional energy is not a renewable resource that comes back just because someone else thinks it should. In older age, your priorities shift, your time becomes more precious, and your tolerance for unnecessary stress naturally narrows. That's not a flaw, it's refinement. This is where defining boundaries becomes essential. When you understand your emotional limits, you're no longer guessing why certain situations feel heavy. You're naming the reason, and naming it gives you the authority to address it. Defining your boundaries also means deciding what topics, behaviors, or emotional loads you're no longer willing to accept. You don't need to absorb someone else's anger because they refuse to manage it. You don't need to hold someone's disappointments because they won't take responsibility. You don't need to be the emotional anchor in every storm just because you've done it before. Boundaries are a shift from automatic yes to intentional choices, and intentional choices protect the emotional space you've worked years to build. Clarity in boundaries also means being honest with yourself. If you need more quiet, say so. If certain relationships require too much emotional labor, take a step back. If you find yourself feeling guilty for needing rest, pay attention to that guilt. It often comes from old expectations that no longer match your current life. This stage of life allows for more honesty, not less. Boundaries aren't just about what you keep out. They're about what you allow in. Allow peace. Allow slowness. Allow conversations that feel mutual instead of one-sided. Allow connections that respect your emotional reality instead of dismissing it. When you define your boundaries clearly, you begin to communicate with fewer apologies. You're not explaining why you need space or offering long justifications for your decisions. You're stating what works for you. That level of self-respect isn't cold, it's calm. And calm is a powerful filter. People who respect you will adjust. People who don't were relying on your lack of boundaries, not your presence. The older you get, the easier it becomes to identify those differences. Defining your emotional boundaries is ultimately about choosing not to abandon yourself. It's about acknowledging that your emotional space has structure and deserves protection. It's about understanding that you cannot be everything for everyone and still have anything left for yourself. With age comes the wisdom to see what's worth carrying and what needs to be put down. Boundaries are how you put things down without feeling like you're letting anyone down. They are the instructions that let your life breathe again. Limiting emotional access in older age begins with understanding that not everyone deserves a front-row seat to your inner life. As you grow older, you realize that your emotional energy has a cost, and not every interaction is worth the price. People often assume that because you've been a steady presence, you will remain endlessly available. But availability is not an obligation. Limiting access doesn't mean shutting people out. It means recognizing who has earned the right to be close and who only shows up when they need something. Your emotional space is not a public hallway. It's a private room, and you decide who gets to knock, who gets to enter, and who stays outside altogether. A big part of limiting emotional access is learning to observe patterns rather than intentions. Anyone can have good intentions, but patterns reveal whether someone consistently drains or supports your emotional well-being. Maybe you notice a friend who only calls when they're upset but disappears when you need someone to listen. Maybe a family member brings constant negativity and expects you to absorb it. Maybe certain people treat your calm presence as an unlimited emotional resource. When you start noticing these patterns, you gain clarity about who is taking more than you can afford to give. Limiting access means reducing how often these patterns touch your life and how deeply they affect your inner peace. Another layer of this is controlling the pace of interaction. You don't have to respond immediately. You don't have to pick up every call. You don't have to be emotionally available on demand. Slow responses are not rude. They're regulated. They're a way of saying you value your emotional bandwidth enough to distribute it intentionally. When you slow down your availability, you give yourself time to think, breathe, and decide whether the interaction is worth engaging with at all. That small pause can be the difference between protecting your emotional space and feeding someone else's chaos. Limiting emotional access also means recognizing that not everyone is equipped to handle your deeper feelings. Some people don't know how to listen without judging. Others don't know how to support without inserting themselves. Sharing your emotions becomes safer when you reserve them for people who actually have the emotional maturity to hold them. You get to decide which relationships stay surface level and which ones earn access to the more vulnerable parts of your life. There is nothing wrong with keeping certain interactions polite, brief, or neutral if that's what protects your emotional health. It's equally important to understand that emotional access is not a reward or punishment. It's alignment. People who respect your boundaries naturally rise to the level of access you give them. People who push, guilt trip, or demand more than you can offer show you why access needs to be limited in the first place. You don't have to confront everyone or explain your reasoning. Sometimes limiting access is as simple as shortening conversations, reducing time spent together, or shifting the tone of interactions. These small adjustments create emotional distance without creating conflict. Ultimately, limiting emotional access is an act of self-preservation. It allows you to maintain balance without absorbing unnecessary emotional weight. It helps you invest your energy where it will be respected, appreciated, and reciprocated. And it protects the emotional space you've built through years of experience, reflection, and growth. Communicating without over-explaining becomes a powerful shift in older age because it gives you back the emotional energy you've spent trying to justify yourself for years. When you've lived long enough, you begin to see that most explanations are attempts to control other people's reactions. You explain to avoid conflict, to soften disappointment, or to keep the peace. But peace built on over-explaining is fragile. It depends on how well you can manage someone else's feelings instead of honoring your own. Communicating clearly without the extra weight of justification is not cold or dismissive. It's mature. It's grounded. It's a way of saying you trust yourself enough to stand on your decisions without needing permission from anyone else. Over-explaining often comes from old habits. Maybe you grew up believing you had to be agreeable to be accepted. Maybe you were taught that saying no required a detailed reason to be valid. Maybe you spent years in relationships or work environments where you felt the need to defend every choice you made. Those patterns sink deep, but they can shift. Communicating without over-explaining starts with recognizing when you're about to say more than you need to. It's that moment you feel compelled to justify a boundary or soften a message by adding unnecessary context. If you listen closely, you can hear the pressure rising in your mind, telling you that your clarity is not enough. That pressure is not truth, it's conditioning. To break the habit, you begin by shortening your responses, not in a blunt or dismissive way, but in a clean, self-assured way. Instead of saying you can't attend something because of a long list of obligations, you can simply say it doesn't work for you. Instead of explaining why you need space, you can say you need time to yourself. Instead of justifying a decision with a detailed backstory, you can say it's the choice you're making right now. These simple statements protect your emotional space because they stop you from giving pieces of yourself away through unnecessary explanation. Every extra sentence is emotional labor, and conserving that labor is part of caring for yourself. Communicating without over-explaining also means trusting that other people can handle their own emotions. When you remove the explanations, you're giving others the chance to manage disappointment, confusion, or frustration without placing that responsibility on your shoulders. This is not unkind, it's respectful. It assumes others are capable adults who don't need to be shielded from honest communication. The more you practice this, the more you realize that you don't need long explanations to be understood. In fact, the people who respect you will understand you more when you speak clearly and concisely. Those who demand explanations often do so because they benefit from your emotional overextension. Another key part of communicating without over-explaining is staying anchored in your tone. Calm, steady communication creates clarity without added justification. When you say something with a grounded tone, people feel the difference. It signals that your decisions come from a place of intention, not defensiveness. You don't have to rush. You don't have to soften your boundaries with extra details. You don't have to preempt someone else's reaction. A slow, steady tone reinforces that